Welcome, listeners, to Days of Our Cyber Lives, a podcast series presented by the Indiana Bond Bank. And we are here for a breaking news podcast. We just dropped episode 7 of the podcast, but there's been some breaking news nationally in Oldsmar, Florida in particular, that has some real impact for the way Hoosiers live their lives and potential impact on you and local governments. And so the treasurer, Shatrice, and I wanted to come together and put together a very quick breaking news update with an expert in the water and wastewater utility field, someone who sits on our council. Kelly, welcome. It's good to see you again. Sorry under these kind of circumstances, but so glad we could do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to be here again. I mean, always good to be with you all, but it's quite an important topic that we are going to be focusing on today. And I'm so glad to have Shatrice with us, as always. And Shatrice, would you mind introducing our guest?
Yes. So today I have with me, because most certainly I never claim to be an expert in all things cyber. I'm only as good as the people I have around me. So who I have with me is the Vice President of Information Technology for Citizen Energy. And they managed a variety of utilities, including water, wastewater, steam, energy, gas. But more importantly, what Mr. John Lucas does for the governor's Executive Council on Cybersecurity is he is the chair of the Water and Wastewater Committee, who has done some amazing things over the last couple of years, provided some good resources to not only local governments here in Indiana, but has actually set some good standards at a national level for things that we should be asking water, wastewater utilities, or as a water, wastewater utility, the questions we should be asking ourselves. And so he was frankly, as soon as I heard what happened in Florida, he was the first person I called to say, hey, what does this mean? Can you break it down for me? Because sometimes when you hear the media, it may sound a lot scarier than it is. Unfortunately, this situation is a scary situation through and through. Has definitely shaken up the water wastewater industry because of how close to home it can be. And then most certainly, Kelly, you know, I really appreciate the fact that you're like, hey, we need to get somebody on as soon as we can. So with that, I'd like to introduce John, our chair of our Water Wastewater Committee for the Indiana Executive Council on Cybersecurity.
Well, Shatrice, thank you for those nice words, and I'm happy to be here and glad to work with all of you.
Well, thank you. And John, just really thank you for taking the time to talk with us. You know, anytime there's an issue that involves a cyber threat or cyber attack on a critical infrastructure of a facility, such as a utility or service provider, that can impact an entire community, we of course are all very concerned. We had planned to have you as a guest in the future, but the recent events in Oldsmar, Florida certainly had us reaching out earlier. And I think Shatrice used the right word, scary, because this incident got really scary because it went beyond stealing personal identification or putting ransomware on a computer. It involved public safety. That said, not everyone that's watching might really know what happened. Would you mind, John, explaining to us what did happen in Oldsmar?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. And it is definitely a potentially scary situation. I will say that the Oldsmar water utility operators acted very quickly to keep that from happening. But the potential for some pretty serious health situations could have occurred if they hadn't. What had happened is a hacker was able to access their computer system through a computer that they had set up for remote access for some vendors to come in and do work on the system when needed. The hackers were able to bypass the security and log in. They had done so the night before. The operator noticed that when he came in the morning, hadn't done anything, and at that point, the hacker accessed the system again and actually, while the operator was watching, modified the sodium hydroxide, which is used to get rid of some bad things in water, rust and some other stuff that people don't like when they drink. And unfortunately, he increased the setting by 11,000 times, which would have significantly puts them at that level that would be way above safe levels. And if that had gotten into the water supply, that could have been, introduced some toxins to people to drink. The operator noticed it, immediately disabled the remote access, and then set the sodium hydroxide level back to safe levels. So as it turned out, it did not cause any issues with the supply, the safety of the water, but it definitely was very significant if that individual had not noticed it.
Wow. Thank goodness he was watching and paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and maybe continuing to use this as an example, but what impact would a situation like that have on the local government, given the fact that much of the time the utility is operated by or is part of a municipality itself?
Yeah, that's a good question, because as you said, especially in Indiana, almost all of the small water companies, majority of them, are operated by the municipalities themselves. And in most cases, the water companies rely on the city's IT department to provide that safe and secure access, and to provide that cybersecurity. So in that scenario, if it would have happened in somewhere in the Indiana area, the local municipality would immediately need to be aware of it, understand it. They would need to work out, either their own experts that they have on staff, or any of the experts that they use on a regular basis to help support them, to immediately come in and to stop and protect from that threat. The other thing that I think is really more happening today is just making all of local governments spend time asking questions about, are we safe? Do we have remote access? Do we have secondary controls in place? Because one of the things that most water companies have is secondary pH or other testing that would have picked up on the fact that this change had been made, even if they hadn't seen it. And the water operators would have been alerted to something going on with the water system, and then they would have responded to understand what was happening, and then in most cases would have been able to reverse that change very quickly. But that's something that the local municipalities need to ask and make sure of are in place today in each of the water companies. I would say the other thing they need to do is make sure that if they do have remote access, my recommendation would be to turn it off, because it's not something that, as we've learned, as smart as we are, the hackers tend to figure out ways to be smarter, and it only takes one time for them to be successful. So my first, recommendation would be to just disconnect it. And if there was a need for support, remote support, especially with COVID-19 going on, that becomes more prevalent than it ever has before. I would just have them turn on that remote access, 5 minutes before the third-party service provider would log in, monitor their behavior, and then disconnect it as soon as they were done. Those are some very simple safeguards they could do today to keep themselves more safe and secure.
Yeah, and I like the fact that that John brings up the point of the kind of things people have had to put in place because of COVID, right? Because I don't think people are, and we've talked about this on the show, right? Like local government or even employees at home are not maliciously making these mistakes to allow these bad actors to get in, but most certainly the bad actors know, and just because we're human, that people are going to make mistakes, or they're going to have to, because they had to do it very quickly, figure out a remote program that may not have been tested well, or, to John's point, not really getting, having the time to learn the best practices, such as simple as turn it off when you're not using it, and watch whomever's on your network while they are using it, to make sure they're not in areas they shouldn't be, or gaining access, or making sure that the people who have access have the right access and not full admin access or executable access, or whatever the case would be, right? So I think it's important for local governments to learn, from this kind of scary time, that, we could do these small steps. I mean, there most certainly is really good best practices out there, and I'm sure John can kind of speak to the high level of best practices that may take more time and effort and money that water wastewater companies should have in place. But at the very least, I think we can most certainly I guess from a scale up to scale down type of situation, the smallest municipality, the smallest water, wastewater, if it's just for, a subdivision for like 30 houses, should have the same thing in place as a large company, which is don't let anybody access your information unless they have to. If you're not having to do remote, don't have remote just, on. Make sure you have strong passwords, make sure you have, two-factor authentication, which many of the programs have available. It's just you have to go in and select it. It's not usually the default that is there sometimes. It's just those things that I think we can kind of, on the back end of all this COVID craziness and having to rush into things, we can start asking ourselves, how are we best protecting ourselves moving forward? Because people will take advantage of that, and they're still doing that, right, John? I mean, that's what they're seeing across the nation. This is just one that got really close and really scary.
Yeah, there are other examples in the very short future, as in a couple months ago, where some hackers were able to get into a water plant and introduce ransomware and shut down the ability for a water plant to operate. So again, that remote access is a critical thing to really be protective. And Shatrice brought up really a key point. At a minimum, two-factor authentication, if you have to have it on. And for people that don't understand what two-factor is, you probably use it every day when you go to your bank site. It sends you a text message to your phone, and then you have to type that in. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. So you have to have the device, that cell phone, along with knowing your login and password. So those two things make it much safer than just a simple login and password that people have the ability to guess or people have the ability to crack. So those are some really important things that should be there and in place on a regular basis. Well, one of a key resource that water companies should use, and within Indiana, there's actually two and probably more key ones, but one of them is at the national level, the American Water Works Association, awwa.org, has a cyber tool that allows you to walk through a series of questions and identify the risks that you have as a water utility around cyber. It's a very useful tool. It was just redone just maybe less than a year ago, and some members of the council helped participate in making the tool more easy to use and more simple for water operators from small utilities, as opposed to cyber experts to answer. And then what it does is it provides you kind of an individual list of the risks you have and recommendations on which one to start on first. So again, it's not something that's shared, it's for you yourself, your water company only. I would definitely recommend the municipality along with the water operator, because some of the questions, there's no way an IT person could answer. It would require a water operator to be able to answer it. And so that team, I think, would do a great job in sitting down, for an afternoon and going through that assessment. And then from that, the action plan that would come out of it afterwards. The second piece is the state of Indiana, and through Shatrice and her team, and the work we've done with the council, has built a cybersecurity plan template for water and wastewater utilities, which allows you to go through and start to identify all of your assets, serial numbers, phone numbers, version numbers, where the backup is, some very simple administrative things that are very important if you get into a situation where you're attacked. And then with that, obviously the most critical is to have more than one person that knows the service provider that helps you with the industrial controls, the SCADA system, the things that operate the water plant electronically, because you want to be able to get them in very quickly to assist as well. So those are just some things that all municipalities and water companies can do. And in some case, well, in the case of Indiana, it's actually required by state law that water companies have a cyber plan. And that's definitely something that the bond bank, I know, cares about as well, as we work on, providing more investments and helping water companies continue to do what they need to do to keep the water flowing for their citizens.
John, one of the things that struck me about what happened in Florida is the size of the community was really quite small, about 15,000 people. And Mark and Shatrice have heard me talk about my background in local government pretty much on every podcast, but I was a county commissioner of a smaller, more rural community as well. And from what I'm hearing you say, it's almost a one size fits all, as in go through the same steps, the same cybersecurity preparedness, whether you're small or large. But I don't know. Would you add to that?
And here's an interesting thing, and that's a great question, because people tend to think about, well, do I have to do it like a large water utility? And the interesting thing is that the steps you go through, 1 through 5, 1 through 10, are probably the same. But a large water utility may spend half a day on each step in their planning, and a small water utility might spend 5 minutes on some, or might say, I don't have that, and just say no. So you want to walk through the process, because the process is what makes you ask the questions and think about it. But the amount of time you take in each step is going to be really dependent upon the size of the utility, and the amount of technology that you have deployed. There's some water utilities today in the state of Indiana that do not have SCADA systems managing the water company. So they operate it manually. So for them, go to step 1. Do you have any SCADA controls? No. Exit. You're kind of done, because you don't have a cyber risk, because you don't have that access. So I'm going to say it isn't a one size fits all. But some parts of it, the logic, you have to walk through, because that's what makes sure you don't miss something along the way.
And I think the inclusivity of, to your point, Kelly, in smaller communities where it is municipality ran, whereas if you're a large water company, you're probably, you obviously need to work with your local governments, but you're not ran by your local governments. Whereas the smaller companies are also managed by local governments. I think the kind of same questions of awareness, like what do you have in place to have that extra protection, or what is your plan if something happens? It's clear with the Florida that they did the right thing. They reported it to enforcement. They caught it, which is the most important thing, right? Because nobody was able to get sick because of the variety of steps that their system had, and a human being catching it as well. So, I know they probably had, like many SCADA systems, automatic things in place, but a human still needs to say, hey, yeah, something's wrong. I need to look into it further and report it. And then I think they did the best thing that they could have done. And I think it's a very important thing is they went public with it. There's a lot of people who don't go public with those things, but it doesn't help the larger cause of, hey, this is real. And I think people are much more forgiving than they were in the good old Target days, where people know that the cyber bad actors are out there actively looking for everybody. And I think people fault people more so, whether you're government or your private sector, if you don't tell people about it, than to just be honest and say, hey, we were hacked. This is what we have in place. We're safe. We're looking into it. We're going to be better. And then I think people look at that and move on. But I clearly they had a plan in place, or they at least knew who to quickly call. And I think those steps, like John said, assessing yourself. And if you assess yourself and you're, I don't have online systems, you're good. Then all you're having to worry about is probably what are your physical securities and those kind of things. If you are online, then you need to not only ask yourself as an operator, but also make sure that your leadership in your municipality knows what's happening, what your needs are, and why it's important. Because if you are missing things within your operations that can make yourself, even more vulnerable, then your leadership should know. And so making sure those communication channels are open in local government, I think, is the biggest thing that we can say. Communication, right? I mean, in any and every critical infrastructure, with any and every disaster and emergency or situation, it is still the number one thing people, it's the low-hanging fruit, but it's still the number one thing people usually mess up on, is the just basics of communications. So I think with the tools that we have online, with at in.gov/cyber, with the Indiana Cyber Hub that John and his team has worked on very diligently, the tools that the National Water Association have for your self-assessment, and a variety, I think, of training, right, John, that they have too. It's just basic training for cybersecurity. I think those things, there's a lot of things out there that's free that really just takes the effort and mindset to look into it before you feel like you have to go spend thousands and thousands of dollars. Because I think from our perspective, and I know John is a chair on the IECC, we work very hard on figuring out, okay, what's the best practice for an organization who has a large team to focus on it, and how do we scale that down to somebody who's operating a SCADA system and also running payments for, you know, local government as their second job, right? I mean, and that's the reality of sometimes what we're dealing with. And so how do we make it as simple as possible for local government? And John's been instrumental on the council to do that.
So just a question to follow up on that. The resources are great, the AWWA, the IECC template. And John, one thing you said was, say some of these questions, you can't be just the IT person to answer it, and you probably can't just be the water operator. You need that dialogue. Just, so how do you do that? Like, from a human perspective, those two folks may have never met even, right? Now, how do you even, this water operator, how do you make the reach out to who is that IT person in the municipality, or the municipality IT person who loves the ones and zeros, you know, may speak a different language from the water operator, you know, just a human, they know they should. How do you make that match? Or what have you seen to be effective in getting those folks together?
Well, we've done a couple of pilot training where we brought both of those people in the same time. And we're working now on seeing if we can come up with a way to do it in a remote way. So that we can reach all of the areas of the state and do it in a way without having to make anybody travel to Indy or make people travel to another city. So remote learning actually is a phenomenal way to do things in a much more cost-effective way. And meanwhile, for, you know, a small operator, you know, in Southern Indiana, you know, to come up for a half-day training or a day of training is 2 days minimum, you know, with an overnight. So, you know, Shatrice, and we're working with some others in state government to figure out how to do that best. But at the end of the day, I actually find the smaller communities, it's actually in some ways simpler than it is in a large company. Because for the most part, everyone tends to know everyone. So even though you might think that I'm the water operator and the IT person, they probably know each other. They may even see each other on Sunday. And so when you say there's a real good important reason, the safety of the community and the safety of water, water operators, if you think about it, their main goal is to deliver safe water, because if they don't, their neighbors, their friends are impacted. So as soon as you say it's to keep people safe, there's your common goal. And then you get two people that may not work together but know each other, and I think it tends to work a lot better. And then at the end of the day, what we found is, you know, by the time the training and the questionnaires are done, you know, each of the two people, or if there's three maybe, have a much better appreciation and understanding for each other. But, you know, if there's one group of people that I've never found have a problem, is you just say to any water operator, you know, I know you think do everything every day to keep the water safe. Let's try to keep it safe by keeping those cyber hackers out, and they're there to help. So good group of people.
You know, when you talk about the people that work at the utilities, I come back to something that when I first became state treasurer, we did what we called an enterprise risk assessment, and we looked at where are any vulnerabilities in the office. And one of them was, and a big one, line of succession. You know, we have institutional knowledge really concentrated in a couple of people. And so, and they're vital to the success of the office, but we needed to make sure we were imparting what they knew out to others for, you know, a myriad of reasons. And, you know, when you're talking about these smaller utilities, I think you probably run into similar issues where, you know, that knowledge is really concentrated in a handful of people. And do you have any advice that you would give to utilities?
You know, that is probably the most difficult question you'll probably throw at me today. But then again, they're not done, so I'm sure there'll be some more. It's very difficult in a lot of smaller communities where they only have budget for one. So you can't hire a second and let that person work with the first person for 5 years to get that knowledge transfer. And the reason I say 5 years is, 80 or 90% of the knowledge probably gets transferred in the first year. But there's all these one-off, oh yeah, the second Tuesday in July, I do it this way, and I don't do it that way any other time of the year. Well, you got to wait for that time to happen. Or an issue happens where, a fire hydrant gets frozen in the winter because it wasn't shut off correctly. And then how does that impact other parts of the system? Only happens in a rare winter that's cold and because you didn't shut off the hydrant correctly. So there is no perfect way to do it. The best way is to try whenever you can to get that crossover. There's a lot of things that are going on at Ivy Tech and others to try to give water plant operator training. To try to get some younger people trained and ready to help take over. And then really where it kind of ties into cyber is what we find is a lot of times that institutional knowledge gets introduced into the SCADA system, which is the control system for the water company. And so now that SCADA system has the institutional knowledge in it, and it operates, depending on conditions, it automatically makes changes. So that's a great way to do it. But now you're beginning to put yourself more at risk for that cyber attack than when you had a water operator. The water operators that have been around 30 or 35 years can all run the water plant manually and produce safe water. Newer people don't necessarily have that skill. Or as long as there's not an issue, they're fine, but they don't know how to correct quickly for a condition that the seasoned operator would know. So, at best you can try to get somebody in to help early, do that cross training. It was kind of neat. I showed up at a very small water company in a small town in the middle of Indiana and was waiting for the water operator because we were there to ask questions to try to get ready for, how do we make a cyber plan that works with small and large. And, meanwhile, across the road, there was a guy in a John Deere tractor mowing the football field. He saw us, drove over, parked the rig, got off, and he was also the water operator. So, Chatrice was spot on with they have multiple jobs. So sometimes you can, bring on somebody in the community and start to cross-train them from a different area, from maintenance, from a custodian in a school, and get that cross-training and not have to pay the extra salary. And then you get a succession plan that way. So there's ways to do it, but you have to be creative. And budget pressure, as you know, are always a big play.
Yeah. And I think a good point that, John has alluded to on several points is that the community, right? I mean, it's really about also don't work in a silo, talk to your community, but also talk to your other water communities, right? Because, as you are, like you said, the fire hydrant thing may happen once in a great blue moon. But most certainly somewhere, someone, if you're kind of in those associations or in those water communities talking to others, it really is as easy as, hey, what do you do in this situation? Or, you have some great people, and I have met some really amazing water utilities, wastewater utility people who, to John's point, just care about the number one thing, which is how do I do this safely? How do I not have a bad day like Florida did? And if I do have a bad day, who can I call quickly? And what do I need to do to get everything and make sure everything's set? And that's really all we really, can ask people to do. And I think local governments, and if people here are listening to this, if you don't know the question and you're in a leadership role, go ask the question. I think, Mark, to your question, how do you do that? Sometimes cold calling and saying, hey, did you hear about this Florida thing? What are we doing about that? Are we good for that? Yeah. I mean, I think these situations, which is why we were wanting to do this, is a perfect jumping off point to start those conversations, to say, hey, do we have something? Or, who would we get in a room if something happened like this? And maybe we should get those people in a room, make sure we all have each other's numbers on a bad day, and we know what the plan is and who to call if something happens. And just doing that conversation, maybe one meeting, right, can take care of a lot of things and make you, so much more prepared than you are right now. And I think if anybody takes anything from this situation, go use it as a jumping off point, get in a meeting, figure out who
Yes.
the right people are to talk to, and just start there. And how deep you want to go from there, kudos to anybody who wants to go do the, as we say, deep dive in the water industry. There's the joke for the day.
It's pretty good.
Nice.
I just beat Mark because he's the pun guy. So
That's the only reason I'm on here.
entertainment value.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so I think that really is the way that we should approach this, as an opportunity to start that conversation if you haven't already. So
Yeah, I agree, Shatrice, and I think that's really important. I think another takeaway that's important is what you had alluded to earlier, is share this information, communicate it if something happens, because look, we're all talking about what happened in a small community in Florida, and we're all going to learn from it, and who knows what it might prevent. It's just so important that we're all doing that. But John, I wondered if you had what would your takeaway message be for the local governments that are listening to this?
I think my takeaway would be, often people think, well, we're small, therefore nobody's going to bother with us. And I think Florida woke us up and said, no. In fact, they may be more interested because you're small.
very good point.
So that would be my takeaway from
Very scary,
Florida.
but yes.
Yeah.
It's really, that was a really important thing to be said, for sure.
Fantastic. John, thank you. Thank you for being the chair of the Water and Wastewater group for the IACC. It's just having a chance to hear you. I feel just great about the leadership, and obviously Shatrice always brings the best guests. So thank you for that, Shatrice. And thank you for the shout out to the bond bank. We do care greatly about water utilities, and as you all may know, we partner with USDA Rural Development and provide the construction financing on all their water and wastewater for their WEP program, and have since the launch of that partnership in 2014, have done over $200 million in construction financing for new and rehabbed water and wastewater utility, just across the board. So if you're in a rural community and you're working with the good folks at USDA Rural Development, you'll be, the bond bank is here alongside you. And if you are outside of the rural development program and do need financing to help modernize a water or wastewater utility plant or treatment facility, certainly reach out to the bond bank. That is why we exist. This is what we're here for, to help units of government continue to progress along their journey. So thank you, John. Thank you, Shatrice. Kelly, thanks for bringing us together again on this breaking news edition of the Days of Our Cyber Lives podcast through the Indiana Bond Bank Bondcast. I'll see you guys. It's good to see you.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Sign off from the treasurer's office. Thanks.
All right.